everybody. For the second part of this evening, we have Professor Ray Miller doing a talk on the psychology of sleep. I will mention that the next event is on the 5th of December. Please put it in your diaries. There's going to be some interesting talks on that evening and another soiree. Slams to everyone. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Ray. Is that your...
Not sure one.
No,
That's the trouble. I should have claimed that one. That's bigger than mine. Mine's half empty. Anyway, about almost exactly a year ago, I think, Alex asked me if I would do some talks on psychology. And I agreed to do a series of 3, but somehow we've ended up at number 4. I'm not quite sure how that happened. Well, actually, I am sure, and I'll explain it in a minute about how it happened. But it's nice to see that there's some familiar faces in the audience from the past 3 talks. That suggests I didn't do too badly at putting you all off. So nice to see you again. Thanks very much for the support. Just before I start, this is a little aside. Last time I was explaining what this symbol is that's up in the top corner here, the Greek letter psi, and I was explaining that is the first letter of psyche, which is the Greek word for mind. But I came across something which I thought was quite interesting in terms of psychology, came across it on the net, and that was somebody explaining a different way of looking at the letter psi. And what they said is that psi is simply you and I. And that seems to me quite appropriate in terms of the way in which we're actually working in the Ragged University. It's very much about you and I and about sharing some of the knowledge, so I quite like that. This was the program as it was originally set up, the 3 talks, and number 4, Sleep Perchance to Dream. And I said I'd explain a little bit about how that came about, because it's quite interesting. It was because earlier on this year, I was approached by Scotland's Colleges Development Network, and they said that they were looking at the National 5 qualification in psychology, and one of the things that had now just been added as a mandatory topic was sleep and dreams. And they said, the trouble is that when we go around to a lot of the teachers who are teaching psychology, they say, what on earth can you say about sleep? And they asked me what I thought, because I've been dealing with the Scotland's colleges for a while. I said, it's a fascinating topic. And they said, well, can you come along and convince these teachers that it's actually worth teaching? So I went along and I gave them a talk. And what you're going to get tonight is very similar in many respects to the talk that I gave them. But it really was quite intriguing to me that teachers reacted in that way. What on earth can you say about sleep? Tonight we're actually going to cover quite a lot of different things. And I always apologize for what gets left out. It's such a big topic that inevitably it doesn't get covered in depth. And some things I will probably rush over fairly quickly because I always put too many things into my talks. And we'll see how it goes. So sleep and dreams. And the history of interest in that goes a long way back, and thinking about what sleep actually is goes a long way back. This is a quote from Heraclitus, who's suggesting that even when people are asleep, they're doing something useful. And we'll come to that and have a look at just how true that actually is. But just one thing is that when I was giving the talk to the teachers, I'll come to it. Right, you've all cottoned on to that. But I have come prepared. So you've been warned. Right. Sleep and dreams. In some ways, you might think, sleep's pretty obvious. We know a lot about sleep in some senses in terms of our experience, because we all need an experienced sleep. And we sleep over a third of our lives, which is where the 30 years in the land of Morpheus comes from, because Morpheus was the god of sleep. And when you add up the amount of sleep you have in a sort of 80-year lifetime, which is somewhere between the average for men and women, that you'll actually have spent something like 30 years sleeping. So it's a very major part of our lives, over a third of our lives. We devote a third of our houses to sleep. So if you look at the average house, you can count the bedrooms, look at the overall space. Most of the space in the house is actually dedicated, or a lot of the space in the house is dedicated to sleeping. We all dream, although we don't always all remember our dreams. It's the stuff of myth and literature. I mean, you don't have to dip very far into any brand of literature or or films or anything, and you find that people are talking about things like sleep and dreams. So it's something people have been talking about for thousands of years, probably. But the interesting thing is that up until very recently, we didn't actually know a lot about sleep. And the reason for that, in some senses, is quite obvious, because it's not something that's generally subject to conscious analysis, because you're not conscious when you're sleeping. And therefore, the only things that we know about sleep, or we knew about sleep, were the observations of people outside, as it were, saying something about what they could see in terms of how they understood sleep. And it's only in the very recent past that that's actually substantially changed. And it changed because initially of things like EEG, which allowed us electroencephalographic measures, which allowed us to measure things like brain waves while people were actually asleep. And more recently, things like brain imaging that's actually enabled us to look even deeper into the brain and see what's happening at a cellular level and see what's happening on a basic biological, bioelectrical level. So the surprising thing is that we actually understand very little about sleep. And one of the things that intrigued me, I said, I give this lecture in May, and between May and now, there's been a huge amount of stuff done on sleep, new material coming up that wasn't there when I gave the lecture in May, which is advancing the understanding of what sleep actually is, how it works, and what it does for us. So this is very much an emerging and fascinating area. But I want to start off with some sleep myths, because there's a lot of mythology about sleep. People think they know about sleep, but don't necessarily know as much as they think they know. And the first myth is that sleep is a passive activity. And in fact, the research shows us very clearly that it's anything but passive. In fact, the brain is highly active during the sleep period. It doesn't shut down. It's not, the consciousness may go, but the actual level of brain activity continues at a very high level. In some cases, even a higher level than it might do while you were actually awake. And there's a regular pattern to that activity as we go through the night, which we'll actually be looking at. So in a sense, Heraclitus was right, that people who are actually fast asleep are actually doing a lot of work and potentially achieving things. Another myth is that everybody needs 8 hours sleep a night. And in fact, the research shows that people are quite variable, but some of the research that's come out since May shows some very interesting things. And it was showing there was a real difference in people's performance and well-being depending on whether they got 6.5 or 7.5 hours sleep as an adult. And it was showing that 7.5 hours sleep seemed to be quite crucial. So what we're seeing here is that sleep varies for individuals to some extent. It certainly varies across the lifespan. Very young children will spend a long time asleep, up to 16 hours. Adolescents will spend 10, 12 hours asleep sometimes, or 8 or 10 hours. And generally in an adult, it's going to be somewhere between 7 and 8 hours. And as I say, we're finding that that time might actually be quite crucial, the amount of time you actually spend asleep. So some more myths. Counting sheep. How many of you have done that? No. Good heavens, we were all taught. Oh, I'm glad somebody did. Yes, thank you. We were all taught to do that, count sheep to fall asleep. But in fact, the research shows that counting sheep might stop you falling asleep. And that people who actually counted sheep took 20 minutes longer to fall asleep than people who thought that following. Drinking alcohol, well, this is obviously one that's very close to you all tonight. But a lot of people think, a glass of whiskey, a glass of wine before they go to bed makes them sleep better. In actual fact, there's some truth to that because alcohol is a sedative and it may well actually help you to get off to sleep more easily. But the trouble is that the way in which the body actually works on alcohol during the night while you're asleep disturbs the sleep patterns and you don't get the same quality of sleep, you don't get the same depth of sleep, quite apart from the fact that you have to get up and pee in the middle of the night. So that's another myth. A warm glass of milk before bed. How many people have had that? Yes, good. And again, there's a vague truth to that because the reason for that is that milk contains tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid. And tryptophan is important in the production of serotonin, which is one of the things that helps the brain to relax and unwind and go to sleep. But the warm milk alone can't do that. It actually needs something to work on. And so there's evidence that people actually need some complex carbohydrates in the body as well in order for that tryptophan to actually work. And we'll see a little bit later on about sometimes having a light snack, for example, before you go to bed actually helps you sleep better. The notion that you can work hard all week and catch up on your sleep at weekends. Sorry, once again, That's a myth that doesn't really stand up. You don't catch up on sleep quite in that way. And if you've actually been sleep deprived for a number of days, then even a solid block of sleep at something like the weekend doesn't necessarily renovate all the things that have been damaged by that sleep deprivation. One for all the teachers around, if there's any teachers around or anybody involved in teaching, the notion that sleep-deprived children will be drowsy at school. And the interesting thing is it's exactly the opposite. If you're an adult and you're sleep-deprived, you tend to become drowsy. But if you're a child and sleep-deprived, you tend to become hyperactive. And why that's quite interesting is that we've seen an enormous rise in young children being identified with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. And one of the things that's being said about that is that many of these children are actually sleep deprived. And what you're seeing in the school is not ADHD. What you're seeing is the result of the sleep deprivation causing the hyperactivity in school. So quite an interesting one. The notion that dreaming only happens during one stage of sleep, REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. But in fact, actually, dreaming takes place through a number of different stages of sleep. But what we do know is that during the REM sleep, the dreams tend to be much more intense. They tend to be much more real, much more vivid. So there again is some truth in that. But in fact, people dream at different stages through the night. Another one, teenagers. I had a teenage son. He's 28 now, so it's a bit late to talk about that. But, I'm sure anybody who's had a teenage son has had this bit about they go to bed and they're not up before 2 o'clock in the afternoon and, they get really lazy, really worn out. You say, oh, these teenagers are lazy bunch. Particularly true of men, I have to say, but also true of women. But again, when we actually look at it, we find there are solid reasons for that the biological clock in teenagers actually goes out of sync. And what happens is that they actually want to sleep later and they actually want to get slightly more sleep. And so they're not actually just being lazy, it's the fact that their biological clock has actually shifted. And then again, in terms of education, there's been some interesting things about that, because if we make these kids get up and be in school for 9 o'clock in the morning, if their biological clock has shifted, are they actually functioning very well at 9 o'clock in the morning? Why start at 9? It might actually be better for a lot of kids in their teenage years, particularly, starting slightly later, when they're actually more likely to be fully awake. So again, some interesting things there. And early to bed, early to rise. Lots of people have said this. But in actual fact, there's no evidence that early to bed, early to rise actually helps people. And there is some evidence that people who are actually late to rise perform better later on in the day. There's no difference in the earlier hours of the day, but they actually perform slightly better in the later hours of the day. So this is really just illustrating that, we talk about sleep all the time. People have all these myths, all this knowledge that we think we've accumulated. Much of it's not really as firm as we might have believed. But sleep's interesting because every organism, or certainly most organisms, I think pretty well every organism actually has a sleep cycle. And we're talking about even plants actually have a circadian rhythm. In other words, their biological clock actually regulates different activities as they go through the day. And there's a shutdown period for plants, much as there is for other animals and human beings. And when we look at animals in particular, we find there's lots of similarities about what animals actually do. So very often an animal will retreat to a particular place to go to sleep. They will adopt a particular sleeping posture, that they have sleep rituals before they go to sleep. There's a general cessation of physical activity while they're actually asleep, a reduction in their responsiveness to stimuli and external things going on. And it's very definitely down to this circadian or biological clock regulation. You can see a clear pattern that follows a 24-hour cycle in pretty well every animal. And also sleep rebound. If you actually deprive any animal of sleep, it will tend to sleep more when it gets the chance. So there's lots of similarities right across the animal kingdom. And it's quite interesting just to look at that. What differs, though, is the amount of sleep that animals actually get. So we've got human beings here somewhere in the middle with about 8 hours sleep. If you're a horse, you only get about 2.9 hours. If you're a bat, you get about 19.9 hours. So although there are these similarities, there are also some interesting and huge differences across the animal kingdom in how they actually use sleep and how much sleep they actually need. But there is this general similarity of the circadian biological clock rhythm, and every animal seems to need some sort of sleep. You get some interesting sleep oddities, though. I quite like the oddities. This is one of them. This is seals. And the interesting thing about seals is that when they're on land, they sleep just like any other mammal. But if they're actually in the sea, only half their brain sleeps at a time. And when we actually look at other aquatic mammals, like dolphins, porpoises, and whales, we find they only ever sleep with half their brain at a time. And the reason for that, when you think about it, is quite simple, because even when they're sleeping, they have to keep swimming. So the whole brain can't shut down. There has to be motor activity being controlled and happening, even while they're actually asleep. So we get some oddities like that in terms of the way in which the animal kingdom deals with sleep. But I was saying, talked about REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. There are several stages of sleep. The first one is the stage where you're actually falling asleep and gradually getting drowsier and gradually shutting down a little bit. And then you go through stages 2 to 4 of sleep, where you're gradually deepening the sleep and the brain waves and things slow down, as we'll see in a minute. And you eventually reach stage 4 sleep after about 80 minutes or so. And that's a stage of what's known as slow wave sleep. A lot of the EEG measures will show slow waves, as we'll see. And then what happens after that is you gradually come back up towards the surface again. So there's this kind of cycle there. And that happens several times during the night. REM sleep is as you're coming back up again, just before the sort of waking stage. And instead of waking up, you go into this rapid eye movement sleep stage, which, as I say, is the more vivid dreaming stage. And you get 4 or 5 cycles during a night. During the night, the patterns change slightly. So at the beginning of the night, you get more very, very deep sleep. And towards the end of the night, you get more rapid eye movement sleep. And we can see this in terms of the pattern of stages as you actually go through. So you've got them going down through stage 1 here, falling asleep, down through the various stages, very deep sleep, coming back up to REM sleep, back down again, back up to REM sleep. And the interesting thing about this is that, at this point, people will be coming back towards the surface again. And you've probably noticed in your own sleep patterns that if you're going to wake up in the middle of the night, it's often after about 3 hours. Why is that? Well, there we are. Now we know why it is, because that's where the cycle's coming back up to the surface. And if something disturbs you at that point, you may well actually wake up. And again, another point after about 6 hours, because of the way in which the sleep cycles are actually working and gradually coming through to the end of the sleep. And as you can see there, more deep sleep at the beginning of the night, more REM sleep towards the end of the night. So that's quite an interesting pattern that actually is there as you go through the night. I was saying that we only know a lot about sleep now because we're actually able to do some measuring. And the classic sort of measures of sleep is what's known as polysomnography. And it measures a number of different things. It measures the EEG, the brain waves. It measures eye movements, and it measures muscle tone, because these are 3 things that change quite drastically as you actually go through sleep. And here we are. This is what it looks like if you're doing these measures while somebody's awake. And what we see is that there's lots of very active movement in the eyes there, lots of very active, high-frequency activity in the EEG patterns, and quite a lot of activity in muscle tone. So that's what it looks like when you're awake. In stage 2 sleep, we can see changes beginning to occur. Eye movement is slowing down, not the very, very rapid movement we saw before. Brain waves are beginning to spread out a bit and beginning to get larger. And muscle tone has dropped quite considerably. You go down to stage 4 sleep. Very different pattern. This is the real slow wave sleep pattern. Eye movement's not really occurring at all now. It looks as if it is here, but in fact, if you look more closely, what you'll actually see here is that these lines about eye movement are actually being affected by the EEG measure. Eye movement has virtually stopped, and what the eye movement detectors are actually picking up is some of the EEG waves. And you can see that quite clearly in areas like this, where there's a clear correspondence between what's happening in EEG and the measures for eye movement. Eye movement has actually largely stopped. And still, again, we've got a very low muscle tone. And then you've got REM sleep, which is very different. And that's to say, as people are coming back up, they're not actually quite awake, but what we see is a pattern that looks very much like what the pattern is when people are awake. So we see, see much more rapid eye movement here again, particularly side-to-side eye movement. We see brain waves that look almost exactly the same as the brain waves when people are actually awake. But what we see down here, interestingly, is virtually no muscle tone whatsoever. So the whole muscle system has completely shut down. The brain is highly active. It's highly active in almost exactly the same way as when you were fully awake. You're getting things like eye movement, but you're not actually conscious, and muscle tone has been shut down virtually completely. And we see that pattern right across the animal kingdom. So if we look at any animals, we can see these different stages of sleep actually occurring to different extents in each animal. So you've got humans there as the comparator, and you can look at the baboon next door, and you see the baboon has more slow wave sleep in their cycle. You can see that rabbits, for example, have got very little REM sleep. But again, overall, the patterns are there. They're actually there right across the animal kingdom, even though they actually vary slightly. There are limitations in some of these abilities to study animals in that kind of way, because on the whole, you are able to study animals where you could readily attach an EEG. So we knew a lot about mammals, for example, rodents, cats, dogs, monkeys. These were the experimental animals that were regularly used. So we've got pretty good information about what happens in their sleep patterns, rather less for some of the other animal kingdom where it's a bit harder to pin them down and stick some electrodes on. So, but nonetheless, as far as we can tell, the things are actually, I would say, are actually true right across the animal kingdom, even though we actually have better evidence for some animals than others. Interesting thing you just ask yourselves, and this is one of the things I was saying to the teachers that they could ask the students, because a lot of people have pets. Lots of people have animals that they can actually observe. Can you actually see these things in your dog, your cat, your budgie, whatever it happens to be? And of course, all the students would go, yeah, of course, I can see that. So it's something that's actually open to your observation. You can actually check out some of these things. But a very basic question is, why do animals sleep at all? And that usually startles people. Because they think, well, of course you sleep. We all do. Yes, but why? Because in fact, there's potentially some evolutionary disadvantages to that. That, for example, you're not taking in nutrients, you're not rebuilding your body by taking in food or water or anything. And that's a major part of what most animals do. They spend a lot of time stacking their body full of nutrients, eating, drinking, whatever. And when you sleep, you're not doing that. So that's potentially disadvantageous. They're not reproducing either. That, one of the main things we think about animals and evolution and so on is that your ability to reproduce is one of the things that marks you down as successful. You're fast asleep, you're not reproducing. So, again, potential disadvantage. And also you're much more vulnerable. That, as I was saying earlier on, one of the characteristics of sleep is you're not as responsive to external stimuli. A lot of your physical processes are actually shut down. That makes you very vulnerable. Why would you make yourself vulnerable? And even more interesting, why do predators usually sleep at the same time as their prey? Because you think, all these rabbits are all fast asleep. The fox should be coming along saying, okay, it's okay for me. But it doesn't work that way. They sleep as well, so there's no advantage there at all. And you think, well, why are they actually sleeping? And there's some interesting theories about why sleep might be important. And we'll be looking a little bit more closely at these. But one of the theories is about energy conservation, the notion that when you're actually asleep, somehow you're saving energy, and that's useful, particularly at a time when perhaps your activity wouldn't be as productive anyway, because at night, for example, you're not going to see things as easily, you're not going to be able to hunt for things as easily or whatever. So maybe energy saving at that time is a good idea. Another is the idea that the body actually needs some downtime in order to repair itself, in order to recuperate, in order to replace things that you've used up during the day to set the body right again. That's another theory. And another theory, which has been particularly promoted by a lot of psychologists, is that the brain, which we've seen is highly active during a lot of sleep, is actually doing something useful during all that time. It's actually processing all the things that have happened to you during the day. It's processing new learning, it's processing memory, processing all these kinds of things and taking the advantage of the downtime of consciousness to get on with that job and consolidate all these important facets of what's going on in your brain. So let's look at these theories. Energy saving. Now, the odd thing is that in actual fact, you don't save a lot of energy when you're actually asleep. That some processes are slowing down, but some processes are actually speeding up. And if you look at it overall, what you find is the net energy saving over the course of a night for somebody who's asleep is about equivalent to having eaten a slice of toast, about 130 calories at the most. So this energy saving bit seems a bit dodgy. You know, the body's not actually saving a lot of energy. And part of the reason for that is that the bit of your body that actually uses the biggest chunk of energy a lot of the time is actually your brain. Brain uses about 20% of the energy in the body. I'm not talking about when you're running fast or something like that. Clearly your muscles are using energy then. But in terms of your general state of being, it's your brain that's actually using up most of the energy that's being created in your body. And as we've seen, the brain's not shutting down. And in fact, during things like REM sleep, it's highly active and using quite a lot of energy. So the energy saving model has got a few questions to answer there. One of the confusing things is that people often assume that sleep is a bit like hibernation, but they're actually two completely different states. When an animal hibernates, it really does switch off and go into a very low energy state. But it's very different from sleep. You can wake somebody out of sleep and they're active again almost immediately. If you wake an animal out of hibernation, it takes sometimes days before they're actually back to fully functioning again, because they have to sort of rebuild all the functions in the body. And in fact, if you've got a computer, you find that too, because the difference between sleep and hibernate on your computer is a bit like that too. So, and the other thing, of course, is that some animals, as we've seen, things like dolphins or whales or porpoises, actually are continuing to be active all the time they're asleep anyway. So they're not actually saving particularly much energy. I mean, if you're swimming, you're swimming. So you're using that energy, whether half your brain's asleep or whether it's not. So the energy saving model's got a few doubts about it. The recuperation model is interesting. The brain's not actually having downtime, as we've seen. The brain continues to actually work. So it's not simply the case that the brain sort of switches off and recovers in that kind of way. That the bit of your brain that develops consciousness certainly slows down, but the rest of your brain is chugging away quite happily. And we find interesting things like people who are actually well rested will often sleep more than people who've been highly active and using energy. So again, you're thinking, well, you know, what's going on here then? It doesn't seem to be directly related to the amount of recovery or the amount of recuperation that you might need. So a bit difficult to understand there. And an interesting one that's been shown in a number of studies is that people who suffer from insomnia tend to live longer. I used to think it just seemed that way. But no, it means you actually live longer, unless they take sleeping tablets. And the sleeping tablets may help them to get to sleep. It actually seems to disrupt the sleep pattern itself. Sleeping tablets don't give you the same quality of sleep as natural sleep. And for insomniacs, it also, again, shortens their lives. So some interesting things around this recuperation. But what we actually have been finding much more recently, and we come back to the notion that a lot of studies have begun to show interesting things, even in the last few months, is that they've begun to look at what's actually happening in terms of the rest of the body systems. And they find that things like sleep actually changes the way the immune system works. And there's some evidence that you need a certain amount of sleep for your immune system to actually work efficiently. And part of that seems to be because the way in which the genes in your body actually operate changes according to the biological clock. And that when you're actually asleep, your genes start doing things they wouldn't normally do. They start producing neurotransmitters, replenishing the store of neurotransmitters in the brain, a whole range of different things that they seem to begin to do while you're asleep. So maybe there is something to this recuperation theory after all. Although it's interesting that it appears to bear no relation to the complexity of sleep cycles, because as we were seeing, for example, in animals, some animals are sleeping very little, some animals are sleeping a lot, yet the recuperation, if it's important, seems to be taking place, whether it's a long sleep, a short sleep, whether it's a lower animal brain, whether it's a human brain. So still some questions to answer. But as I say, interesting research coming up, and this is a slide that wasn't in the one that I was talking to the teachers about, because this is all stuff I've picked up since. One of the things, for example, which I mentioned, is the difference between getting 7.5 hours sleep and 6.5 hours sleep. And there's clear evidence that that actually makes an impact on the way in which your body is recovering during sleep. So we know that, for example, with more sleep, you tend to get less interference with body mechanisms. So things like the immune system, for example, can be overactive if you're not getting enough sleep. And that does things like damage joints and things. You get the body attacking itself because the immune system is detecting some of the body's own mechanisms as hostile, and is actually then producing responses which are counterproductive, and you get inflammation in joints and things like that as a result of that kind of stuff. We know that the brain, the body is not dealing with stress hormones in the same sort of way if you're not getting 7.5 hours sleep. Things like the risk of cancer, the risk of diabetes appear to increase if you're not getting 7.5 hours sleep. Just an hour's difference between 6.5 hours and 7.5 hours, but it looks as if, from recent research, that hour's difference actually makes a significant difference to how your body is actually dealing with the recovery and recuperation process. Another thing is that all the nerves in your body have a kind of covering that protects them that's known as the myelin sheathing. And one of the things that seems to happen at certain stages of sleep is that the body actually starts producing more myelin in order to insulate the nerves and protect them as a result of any damage they might have suffered during the day, wear and tear generally. And again, the evidence is that if you don't get the right quality of sleep, that replacement of the myelin sheathing doesn't occur, and that can lead to some diseases of the nervous system. And there's some evidence that a little bit like your computer, your neurons in your brain can get blocked up from time to time. You get the blue screen of death, but not quite. And the neurons are sort of saying, hang on, guys, we're in a bit of a mess here. And what happens when you sleep? It's like pressing the reset button on your computer. It sets it back to zero again, and everything begins to pick up from there. And there's some evidence that's actually happening in the brain, that neurons only have a certain capacity to deal with things. Once they get sort of choked up, you need to press the reset button if you're going to then continue with things like memory and learning and all these kinds of things. And that's all research that's coming out only now because we can do things like brain imaging and actually look inside the brain and see what's happening at a cellular and neuronal level. Brain efficiency. We know that if you actually deprive people of sleep, it certainly seems that the brain gets less efficient. So there are problems about attention, there's problems about learning and memory, and we also know that people get more irritable if they don't get sleep. And again, I'm sure that's something you've all experienced yourselves, grumpy. So, my partner will tell you all about me if I don't get enough sleep and I'm very grumpy, but I'll leave that for another day. One of the interesting things is that sleep, because as I say, the brain continues to be active during sleep, there's evidence that the brain actually continues to work on things that you've been thinking about during the day. And in fact, there's a whole series of references in history to people who claim that they made their key discoveries after a good night's sleep. They went to bed with a problem and they woke up and suddenly they had a solution. And that's not just mythology. It appears to be actually true. The brain actually continues to work on these things. We can see that the brains continue to be active in the areas that were being activated during the day and just before you went to sleep. We know that things like if people are trying to learn to play a difficult piece on the piano, they can go to bed and wake up, and it's easier when they wake up because the brain has actually continued to work on some of these issues and some of that material while the person has actually been asleep. So, say brain imaging shows that areas that we've been using a lot during the day don't just suddenly shut down, they tend to remain more active within the brain while you're actually asleep. So sleep may critically facilitate the efficiency of the way in which we actually work in our brains. Not entirely essential, because clearly even if you don't get a night's sleep, you do function the next day and you are able to think and you are able to remember things. So it's not absolutely critical, but it certainly seems to facilitate good functioning in all these ways. Yeah. Not sure whether it's entirely true of animals that have very low complexity in the brain. So as I say, part of the problem is it's harder to check things like whether ants are working in the same way as monkeys are or humans are. But certainly we know that in complex brains, this appears to be a pattern that's generally true. But the length of sleep that the animal has doesn't seem to be correlated with the amount of efficiency. And we saw great differences in the amount of sleep that animals get. And yet, even a horse, which has survived for hundreds of thousands of years, is doing quite nicely on its 2.9 hours sleep. So the relationship's not entirely clear. We don't know everything there is to know at this stage, but there is strong evidence that there is some brain efficiency processes going on here. One of the questions is, does that efficiency occur because sleep is necessary to it, or does the brain just take the opportunity of sleep to actually catch up on a lot of things that were going on anyway? Sleep deprivation is certainly quite interesting. It's quite hard to get good information on human sleep deprivation because it's a bit unethical to stop somebody sleeping. Now, one of the interesting things, as somebody brought up in one of my previous talks, is that I'm sure there's more evidence about this than we think there is, because I'm quite sure that people like Guantanamo Bay, for example, have used things like sleep deprivation as part of the interrogation techniques. So I'm quite sure that people like military and so on have got better information on this than we might actually know about. But certainly in terms of psychological studies, there's a limit to how much you can stop somebody sleeping to check what's happening. This is a guy who, Randy Gardner, who actually did it to himself as part of a school project. He decided he would stay awake for 11 nights. And there are anecdotal stories of some people who've done it to themselves and done it for longer. But the interesting thing about Randy Gardner was that he was actually being observed and monitored and measured while this was going on. So we know more about what was happening. And certainly through sleep deprivation, he became progressively more disorientated. He became impaired in his speech and his vision. He became much more moody. He started to have delusions of various sorts, particularly paranoid delusions, as his sleep deprivation went on. But when he was finally allowed to sleep, he didn't actually replace all that sleep. He only replaced a proportion of that sleep. So although he'd actually lost something like 90 hours sleep, when he was given the opportunity to catch up, he only caught up on about 11 hours of that. So clearly you don't need to replace all that sleep for the brain to get back to its normal state. There's the interesting question, what's the equation here? How exactly does it work? And we don't really fully know the answer to that yet. Certainly one of the things that happened when he did sleep was that you saw a change in his sleep pattern. And what you saw was much more rapid eye movement sleep, for example, in the sleep cycle. So where normally that would be a relatively smaller part of the sleep cycle, its frequency actually increased quite significantly when he was allowed to catch up again. So maybe there's something particular about the REM sleep bit that actually is the recuperation bit. Just one interesting thing which I've alluded to here is that although in human beings like Randy, if you deprive them of sleep, nothing terribly disastrous seems to happen. Rats, for some strange reason, are different. If you actually have rats and you deprive them of sleep for about 3 to 4 weeks, they just die. And there's nothing obviously wrong with them. There's no clear lesions or anything. There's nothing seriously wrong in terms of their general health. They just suddenly die, just like that. No other animal, as far as I'm aware, does that. We don't know why rats are different. And the other interesting thing is if you take your rat at sort of 2.9 weeks and say, have a night's sleep, it recovers perfectly. So there's some very funny things going on in terms of sleep and sleep deprivation in that sense. And although we know a bit certainly about how it operates in humans, there are still lots of things we don't actually know. We do know there's lots of negative effects. And this is just a list of lots of negative effects of sleep deprivation, many of which I'm sure you'll recognize from your own experience: lower stress threshold, impaired memory, decreased optimism, all these kinds of things. And it's quite interesting just to look at the impact that loss of sleep actually has. Just want to talk briefly about sleep disorders. The most obvious one is insomnia, not being able to get to sleep, difficulty sleeping, daytime fatigue, leading to sleep deprivation. That's the problem for a number of people. Sleep apnea, and I always like this quote: laugh and the world laughs with you, snore and you sleep alone. Anthony Burgess' Clockwork Orange was he's the author of Clockwork Orange, said that. Circadian rhythm biological clock disorders, the most obvious one of which that people experience is things like jet lag. If you've ever done long flights, you've almost certainly suffered a degree of jet lag. But shifted sleep patterns generally, if your sleep pattern shifts during the day and upsets your biological clock, and again, one of the most common aspects of that is shift work. That if people are working occasional night shifts, and mainly day shifts, that's actually quite disruptive. If they shift entirely onto night shift, it's less disruptive because the biological clock adapts. But if they're sort of coming backwards and forwards between normal circadian rhythms and a shifted pattern like shift work, that can actually be quite disruptive. And there's lots of evidence showing that shift work's bad for people. Parasomnia. Oh, that's just whistling a bit. Parasomnia, which is where people are actually doing things during their sleep. Some of that is simply things like nightmares, but things like sleepwalking is parasomnia. Night terrors, where people, if you're observing them, they appear to wake up and be absolutely terrified, showing all the signs of absolute horror and terror, shaking, sweating, then they fall asleep again. And when they wake up, they don't remember that. But it's happened nonetheless. And acting out dreams, that people sometimes will act out what's happening in their dream and go through the motions and go through the behaviors that would be associated with the dream. That's all parasomnia. And the opposite, which is narcolepsy, people who fall asleep at the drop of a hat. They'll be sitting talking to them 1 minute, the next minute they're fast asleep, and they've got no control over that. They're not aware of the falling asleep process. It just suddenly seems to happen. If you look at insomnia, it's actually very common. It's reckoned that about 1 in 10 adults has persistent insomnia, and that's defined in this way: 3 or more nights of lack of sleep in every 7 for more than 3 months at a time. And about 1 in 10 people will tell you they have problems of that sort. The typical insomniac, however, if you look at the things that are going on for them, you can see why some of their behaviors may actually be contributing to that difficulty in actually getting to sleep. So people who remain active right up to bedtime, people who are still doing things like studying, reading in bed, trying to do crosswords, whatever, in bed, they're actually keeping their brain active, and it makes it much more difficult to get to sleep. Things like the lighting in the room actually have an effect. So a dark room is actually quite important to good sleep. There's things like the changes that happen in life generally. So women going through the menopause often suffer fairly extreme temperature fluctuations during the night, and that can make it very difficult for them to get to sleep. And sometimes things like medication are important, that adults with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder are oddly enough given a stimulant in order to help to control their behavior. And if they're taking that kind of stimulant medication, they find it very difficult to get to sleep. But you can get the same sort of effect from things like caffeine and so on as well, which will obviously tend to keep you awake. The snoring, inability to breathe during sleep, that's because the bit at the back of your throat there becomes blocked and the airways become blocked, and you're trying to clear that through the actual snoring. It's often related to things like obesity. People who are very overweight tend to snore more. Enlarged tonsils, infections in the back of the throat there all cause people to snore. This one is quite interesting because looking at sudden infant death syndrome, that's the children that just suddenly appear to die overnight for no obvious reason, cot deaths as they're often referred to. There's some thinking that perhaps what's actually happening to them is their breathing's actually getting blocked. And there have been various ways of looking at whether the position they lie in, whether the type of mattress they've got, all these things might contribute to this. But the notion is that this may actually be connected in some way to sleep apnea. There is a more general condition, which is an inherited one that actually can produce sleep apnea, but it's actually very rare. So the central sleep apnea is the inherited one, and it's actually very rare. Parasomnia is interesting. That was the one I was saying about people who end up doing things during their sleep. And this is a very interesting case that I found quite intriguing. And it was about driving while you're asleep. And you might think, how could that happen? Well, here's the case. Becky Mason drove to work in her pajamas on a Saturday night, got to the gate of the place where she worked. The security guard said, what are you doing here in your pajamas? It's Saturday night. Go home. So she got back in her car. Off she went home and crashed. And so when the crash happened, of course, the police were called, etc. And she was found to be over the alcohol in it. But in fact, she was let off. And the reason that she was let off was that on the evidence of a family history of parasomnia And on the evidence of the security guard, who said she was very strange, here in her pajamas, not looking totally with it at all, the court decided that she was not actually responsible. She'd been suffering from parasomnia and driving while she was asleep. She was going through her normal daytime routine, but while she was actually still fast asleep. So just an interesting one, yeah. I don't know whether you get away with that in the courts around here, so I wouldn't try it. But there we go. Sleep hygiene. How do you actually improve your sleep? Well, sleep hygiene is really about the ways in which you can help to maintain your sense of health and well-being by actually looking at your sleep. And there are some basics. One is making sure you've actually got the right amount of time for sleep every day and that you're protecting that time and you don't allow things to intrude on that time. That you keep regular sleep hours, which is about keeping your biological clock ticking at the same sort of level so that you're not constantly upsetting it by changing your patterns. And that's partly about going to bed at the same time and getting up at the same time. Avoiding things like vigorous exercise before sleep, avoiding late afternoon naps, because if you have a late nap, that again tends to change the way in which your biological clock is actually thinking about your need for sleep. Avoiding eating large meals, and that's because the digestive process can actually disrupt your biological clock as well and make it more difficult to get to sleep. So a large, heavy meal may well mean that you don't sleep as soundly. Don't allow yourself to lie in bed and worry. Get up and do something to alleviate the worry. And one of the interesting things is this notion of having 8 hours solid sleep without a break in the middle is a relatively modern notion. If you actually look at a lot of literature, people will talk about waking up, going and doing something for a little while, and then going back to bed later on. And that seems to be perfectly acceptable. And it's actually better than lying in bed thinking, why am I not asleep? Why am I not asleep? Which doesn't tend to work very well at all. Avoiding caffeine. Taking a warm bath before bed can be quite useful. It produces a lot of relaxation in the muscles, and that can help to be conducive to sleep. Listening to soothing music. Using your bed only for sleeping or sex. In other words, making the bed somewhere that you associate primarily with being relaxed and sleeping. So you don't do things like read or watch TV in bed, don't study in bed. You learn to associate your bed with relaxation. Dark, quiet, cool environment. As I already said, that darkness is quite important, but so is temperature. If the room's too hot, you're unlikely to sleep well. In fact, on the whole, your room in which you're sleeping probably should be about 16, 17, 18 degrees, as opposed to perhaps the 20, 21 degrees you might have in your lounge. And that seems to help you get to sleep better. Avoiding oversleeping. If you actually lie too long in the morning, you can half wake up, but you're not fully awake. Lots of really bizarre ideas start to go through your head. Some of these can begin to be quite upsetting at times. And what's more, they also begin to disrupt this whole notion of the rested sleep pattern. Dale Carnegie said, if you can't sleep, then up and do something instead of lying there worrying. It's the worry that gets you, not the lack of sleep. And there's a lot of truth in that. So if you can't sleep, try not to think about, oh my goodness, I should be asleep. I've got an exam tomorrow. Why can't I sleep? Oh my goodness, it's only 6 hours now. Well, it's only 5.5 hours now. If you go on in that kind of way, it doesn't actually help. So it's better to do something else that takes you away from that. Doing something relaxing, avoiding things that will actually up your level of physical activity again, boring activities, and the one I was talking about earlier, eating a light snack. If you remember, I was talking about the tryptophan in milk and the fact that that produces serotonin better if there's a certain amount of carbohydrate in the system. So sometimes a very light snack, not a heavy meal, but a very light snack can actually help the body to relax and get to sleep. Perchance to dream. Again, an area where there's lots of different theories. One of the ones that's been very popular in literature is the notion that dreams somehow foretell the future. And I have to say that despite an awful lot of research in this area, there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. I did a lot of research when I was an undergraduate student looking at parapsychology and looking at psychic phenomena and looking at how that related to the various things that people believed and so forth. And it was quite clear that there was no actual evidence. People would tell you lots of anecdotal stories, but usually these anecdotal stories were after the fact. So, something had happened, the person, oh yes, I dreamed about that. But very few people actually said beforehand, I've dreamed that this is going to happen, and then it does. I'm not saying it never happens, but the law of averages is that it's bound to happen sometimes. but there's no real evidence that the dreams are a portent of the future in that kind of way. We get into the area of the psychodynamic theory, the interpretation of dreams, and the work of people like Sigmund Freud and those who followed after him who saw dreams as very important. We'll talk about that. The physiological theory, which is based much more on what's actually happening in your body, what's actually happening in your brain at a physiological level. And the cognitive theory, and I've already mentioned about, what's the brain actually doing usefully during that time and how might that affect things like dreams. So if we take Freud, for example, most of you will be familiar with his idea that there's different levels in the brain. There's the id, the superego, and the ego. And a lot of what he said was going on in the brain was unconscious. In other words, it didn't rise to the level where you were actually aware of what you were thinking or how you were thinking. And the brain was simply processing a lot of stuff based on other kinds of criteria. And his notion was that dreams were a way of tapping into all that when you shut down the consciousness, then you were shutting down the kind of filter system that normally stopped you getting at these other things that might be going on underneath the surface. So he was very interested in what dreams might tell him about what was really going on in people's minds. And his notion was that the dream was the way in which people expressed things that they couldn't express during the waking state, that were unacceptable to express during the waking state. Things like their sexual urges, for example. Freud was very keen on sex. Fell out with some of his followers over that who weren't quite as keen on sex, but quite as keen on interpreting things about sex. Then his notion was that this was all the hidden activity that we couldn't express because it was unacceptable for one reason or another during the day, but it was there in the dreams because the filter had gone, the conscious filter was not working, the sensor had shut down, and that therefore if you understood what was happening in the dreams, you could see what the real in-depth urges were of the person. So the notion was that the basic biological drives activate the brain produces symbols and things in relation to that, and if you understand these symbols, you can understand the processes. So dreams as windows on the unconscious mind, dreams as wish fulfillment. He thought there were different kinds of content in dreams. Some of it was incorporating activities that had happened during the day would appear in your dreams, but some of it was a story that was actually explaining what was going on at these deeper levels. And the idea was that by actually examining all these symbols and things and looking at the processes that the brain was carrying out, you could come to understand the deeper content. And he would do that through things like free association, for example, which was, again, an attempt to shut down active consciousness by kind of switching it off and letting the mind run free. And he would also look at things like defense mechanisms, the way in which some of the things that were there in dreams were supposedly defending you against these deeper urges and so forth. So there were various characteristics to that. One was displacement, that something that occurred in a dream might not mean itself, it might mean something else. And the famous one, of course, is Freud and cigars. Although apparently he never did say sometimes a cigar was just a cigar. The idea was that these things which appear in dreams as symbols actually are standing for something else. Particularly, he was interested in the sexual connotations. But sometimes two or more elements in a dream would be combined, and you had to sort of disentangle that to find out what the in-depth processes were that were going on. That visual images would come up because very often the deep emotions would express themselves as sort of almost like a picture or a caricature of what that emotion actually represented. And then the brain would be trying to make some sense of that and would make a story, which would be what the person would tell the psychologist, the psychiatrist about their dream, trying to put all these different bits together. But Freud's idea is, well, yes, I know what you're telling me the story is, but in fact, when I look at all these different elements, I can see there's something else going on underneath that that's actually much more important. So the goal was to uncover the latent content through the analysis of what the person actually said, and exploring through free association and things, the dream elements. But there are problems with that. One of the problems is that the dream is recalled at a distance in time, so you're usually asking people to remember, what did you dream last night, what did you dream last week? And as psychologists, we know that people's memories are not very reliable. The other thing is that the individual, because of the very fact that they're actually seeking therapy, is usually in some distress. And there's lots of evidence that suggests that may actually change the way in which things like their dreams work. So whether you're getting an accurate picture of what's really going on or whether the actual distress that the person's experiencing changes that is open to question. And the other most damning thing about it is that in a lot of psychotherapy, what happens is it's the therapist who's actually suggesting to the subject, oh yes, your cigar really means, and then of course the subject says, oh yes, that's right. And they begin to absorb the therapist's view of what's actually being said about the dreams. So there are lots of caveats about this. How do you actually validate the interpretation that the therapist actually gives? Physiological theory is saying, as we've already seen, the brain is actually highly active during the sleep period, particularly the deep brain, the brain that actually controls things like the biological clock. And it's sending out signals all over the place to different bits of the brain. And what's happening as a result of that is that these bits of the brain are responding. And we know that certain areas of the brain are particularly associated with certain kinds of activity. And when these areas are activated, they actually create apparent realities, because it's exactly the same as if it was being stimulated externally. As far as that bit of the brain's concerned, if it's being whacked with a signal, it can't actually tell the difference whether that signal is internally generated or externally generated. So the cortex of the brain is actually receiving all these different kinds of signals and responding to them. And as a result of that, you get things like the rapid eye movement, because the signal's being sent to the eyes saying, move around. You get what's known as vestibular activation, which is your balance organs. Those signals being sent to the balance organs in your body, which are just like the signals that would be there if you were actually moving around. You get inhibition of the motor neurons in the body, so the muscle activity, as we saw in the earlier traces, shuts down virtually completely. But you get autonomic activation, so things like heart rate changes, blood pressure changes as a result of these different signals that are being sent around. And the brain has to make some sense of all that. So when the visual cortex is being stimulated, the brain tends to perceive that as visual images, which become then part of your dream. The vestibular part of the brain, the balance organs are stimulated, and the body interprets that as, I'm moving. And that very often is, people then report things like sensations of flying, because they have this feeling, my body's floating, moving, because these balance organs are all being stimulated, and that's what they're telling me. Things like chase dreams, that, as I say, the signals are being sent out to the muscles and so on, but the muscles aren't responding. So what the brain is saying, move these muscles, move these muscles. And the muscles are saying, no, tough luck, we're shut off tonight. And the result of that is there's no kinesthetic feedback from the muscles. And so the brain interprets that as, I'm trying to move and nothing's happening. And we get these sensations of people being chased and being unable to run away, for example, very common in dreams. So when we look at the sort of activation theory, when we find there's actually quite a lot of what's happening in people's dreams can be explained by the different areas of the brain that might be being activated. And this is quite a complex slide. I'm not going to go through it in any detail. But in fact, I've actually given Alex a copy of the slides. So I'm sure he will make these available if you want to look at a slide like this in more detail. But it explains how the activation of different areas of the brain commonly produce certain things within the dreams. So the goal in this is actually to relate what we know is happening in terms of brain activation to the content of the dream. And we can actually record that much more clearly, because we can record the physiological measures and we can ask people immediately in a sleep laboratory what they actually experienced during that time. Argument is, well, sometimes the lab setting itself might upset the way in which people record things and remember things. Okay. And even though we're actually taking physiological measures, we're still reliant on the kind of self-report of the client about what that's meant to them. I mean, there's no way you can actually look at an EEG and say, oh, yes, that's a dog they're dreaming of. Although, again, there's some interesting research recently that shows that in some circumstances you can begin to do that, because if you present somebody with the symbol of a dog quite regularly and see how the brain reacts to that symbol, you can then detect that same reaction during a dream. But it's very highly specific. It only works if you've actually trained that sort of response in the first place. So it's not a general way of tapping into people's dreams and seeing what's going on. And the other thing is that, when people come along and volunteer for things like sleep labs and dream labs, you never know what their agenda is. And people are often coming along with quite different agendas about why they want to take part in this kind of experiment in the first place. Cognitive theory, the idea that dreams are information processing. We said there's lots of evidence that brain efficiency is certainly greater or helped by sleeping. And we can see that in terms of dreams too, that the dreams are symbolic acts. They actually mean something to the people that are going on. It's not just random activity. They're actually integrating a lot of different aspects of their knowledge and experience into that dream. They're based on what people know. Children, for example, have much simpler dreams than adults. And that's because we know less, so we've got less to remember and less to integrate. But dreams use dissociated pieces of memory and knowledge. So it's like, diving into a big tub of lots of things, and the dream picks out a handful here and a handful there. So they don't always make sense in some respects, but they're all based on what was in there in the first place, and the brain actually then tries to reorganize that. So dreams are generally organized. Dreams have realistic features. People are people. Objects are real. And what's actually happening a lot of the time is that this brain activation is producing memory activation, and the brain is then recovering things like stored memories. And as I say, it does that in a fairly haphazard way a lot of the time. It's a bit like having lots of bits of a jigsaw puzzle, and the brain dives in there, picks up different bits and tries to fit them together to actually make a picture. And that picture will have things from the daytime, it will have things from memory, it will have things that are part of the activation and stimulation of the brain, all trying to be molded together into something that the brain can see as meaningful or sensible in some way. But it's not something that's driven by underlying sexual desires. So Freud, I'm afraid, not much evidence for him in terms of that. There's a dream production system making sense of the activity that's going on in the brain. It creates a story. There's evidence that it creates more intricate stories when you're actually in REM sleep. So the stories tend to be more involved, more vivid. Dream recall is difficult, and people often talk about, the fact it's very difficult to recall dreams. And the idea is that's partly because the dream, what your brain's doing during the dream is creating a story, not trying to remember a story. And the act of creation and the act of memory are slightly different acts. So if your brain's actually doing the creation process, it's less likely to actually remember the content, and that seems to be borne out. Children's dreams actually change as their cognition changes as they get older, so children's dreams get longer as they get older. They change from being static dreams that young children will often dream of something like my teddy bear, but later on it'll be my teddy bear doing something. So it becomes a little bit more like a video rather than just a static element. And what's more, that's particularly true about their relationships with people. So initially, the dreams will very often be about symbols, and it'll be about things that are meaningful to them. My pet dog, or my teddy bear, or whatever. As they begin to develop, the dreams will have a social element. It'll be about the interaction between people. It'll be about how they're getting on with somebody or not getting on with somebody, or the way in which people are treating each other. So that's their cognitive perception is changing, so the content of the dream changes. And also, in fact, that when the children are very young, they don't tend to dream about themselves. But then as they begin to develop and get this sense of self and get this sense of social relationships, so their dreams come more and more to actually contain the child itself. So again, we can begin to understand what's happening in dreams in terms of the cognitive processing that's going on, the way in which the brain is actually accessing and dealing with information and memories, and using these to construct something that makes sense while that process is actually going on, creating a story. Again, it's retrospective. You only find out what the story is when the person wakes up and you ask them. There's issues about cognitive bias. Is the person particularly inclined to report certain kinds of things and hide other kinds of things? Anyway, coming towards the end, just a couple of things I want to cover very briefly. One is lucid dreams, which is a very interesting area. And that is where people who are dreaming are aware they're dreaming. Now, I discovered this when I was a kid. I had a very frightening experience in a local park where I was quite young. I was about probably 6 or 7 in this park. And some big lads who seemed very big at the time, but were probably about 12 or 13, were being a bit bullying and frightening the life out of us. And I had nightmares. And I would wake up in the middle of the night with this nightmare that I was being chased and so on with these lads. And then one night, suddenly in the middle of the dream, I thought, this is just a dream. I can change this. And I chased the lads away. And it came out different. And I thought, this is okay. And in fact, people actually report exactly this kind of thing, that when they're aware they're dreaming, you can change the course of the dream, you can change the outcome of the dream. The other thing I used to do is, something bad would happen in the dream, I'd say, no, let's rerun that, wind it back, play it forward again with a different outcome. These are things where people seem to be lucid dreaming. And it is quite an interesting phenomenon. One of the interesting aspects of it is that if you tell people that lucid dreaming is possible, they tend to do more lucid dreaming. So just the very fact that you know you can do that and recognize what's happening in a dream actually makes it more likely you can do that. And we did some tests in the sleep lab about whether people actually knew they were dreaming or not. Now, it's quite difficult because we've heard things like muscles and so on are completely dead. So there's no way they can sort of wave their hand or something if they know they're dreaming. What does happen, as we know, is that during REM sleep, the eyes move. So what we said to people is, if you know you're dreaming, move your eyes in a particular pattern. And lo and behold, people could do that. So they were actually fast asleep, knew they were dreaming, and were able to actually signal that they knew they were dreaming at that particular point. Interesting. Sleep paralysis is another one, and it's one that's said to account for a lot of things like alien abductions, the notion of people feeling the presence of ghosts and spirits in the room, etc. That there's a stage in sleep where you're not really awake and you're not really asleep. And during that stage, as we've known from the graph we saw earlier, your muscles are likely to be completely shut down. And so people often wake up, feel unable to move, or think they're waking up. They feel unable to move, they feel trapped, they feel paralyzed. And they attribute that to things like maybe there's a weight pressing down on me, or somebody has struck me down to the bed, or an evil spirit has possessed me, or whatever it happens to be. And there's evidence that that's actually part of the way in which they're interpreting this stage of sleep paralysis, where the body is completely relaxed, the muscles are completely shut off, they're partly awake but not fully awake, and therefore not fully interpreting what's actually happening around about them. And you get people during that particular stage reporting not only things like ghosts and spirits and alien abduction, but the presence of God and all kinds of other things, which seem to be related to that very funny stage of sleep paralysis. And for some people, it's very frightening. People tend to get the impression very often that this sleep paralysis goes on and on. All the evidence is it actually lasts a matter of seconds, but their time distortion in that particular period makes it seem to them as if it's actually lasting longer. So that's a thing that's quite interesting in its own right. More likely when sleep's actually been disrupted due to things like stress, shift work, alcohol, etc. And as I said, it may account for some of the more bizarre things that people report. But this is just a final quote from one of the people who's done a lot of sleep research. And what he's saying is, even just taking it its basic, given that we spend a third of our lives or more asleep, you would think sleep is a pretty interesting thing to look at. But when you start to look into it, as I hope I've encouraged you to think about tonight, it's absolutely bloody fascinating. I mean, there's just so much there. And as I say, so much that we really don't know yet, because it's only in the last 50 years probably, and even more in the last 10, 20 years with things like brain imaging, that we've really started to get a handle. People have been sleeping for thousands of years, but we never actually knew very much about what was going on in all that. So that's all, folks. Thanks for listening, not falling asleep. And just one thing to say about my series of lectures as a whole is that if you're interested in following up a lot of these kinds of things, there's this website run by a guy called Webb, interestingly enough, David Webb, allaboutpsychology.com. And it's a fascinating site. It's full of all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested in any of this, it's well worthwhile having a look at that and just seeing all the stuff that's there. And also, I run a philosophy and psychology group where we're often looking at issues like this too. Thanks very much.
I've got a question. So very well. I'm interested in melatonin as a way of potentially regulating sleep. Have you come across this, and do you have any thoughts on melatonin as a way of regulating sleep?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm a psychologist and not a biologist, so my knowledge in these areas of some of the technical aspects are limited. But yes, I mean, certainly melatonin has been said to be something that actually helps sleep. I was talking earlier about serotonin, but melatonin also appears to have a role to play. Exactly what that is, I'm afraid I don't actually know, so...
does the volume or character of the activity you perform in the day have any bearing on the type of speaking of the things you can measure? So you have a very busy day, you want to speak to ECG measurement and graph.
There are two parts to that answer. One is that certainly things like physical activity are not in themselves predictors of how much sleep you need. People can actually be quite physically active and not need additional sleep. In fact, as I said earlier on in the talk, sometimes people who are actually quite rested sleep more than people who've been very active. So physical activity, it's not quite clear how that relates. What's clearer, perhaps, is things like mental activity and mental states. So we see things like if you've had a very stressful day, for example, the body's very uptight, lots of autonomic nervous system activity going on, increasing your heart rate, increasing your breathing rate, producing adrenaline, these kinds of things. That certainly disrupts sleep, and we know that the people who are under stress are going to suffer more sleep problems. So there's a clear relationship in that sense between what's been happening to you during the day. If you've had a really bad day, which has upset you psychologically, if you like, you're more likely to have sleep problems rather than just a very busy day that's exercised you physically. So.
Yeah, sorry if I missed this, but you mentioned on one hand, insomniacs tend to live longer lives, yet a lack of sleep going from, as you said, 7.5 hours to 6.5 hours can lead to an increased gene expression of negative genes. So the two correlate, where insomniacs can live longer lives, but with higher instances of diabetes and cancers, or are the two separate?
I mean, that's exactly the point in a sense. And partly, I mean, I was quoting that because it's an oddity. It doesn't entirely appear to fit. And it's an illustration of the fact that there are still things about sleep that we don't fully understand, because on the face of it, you would expect that insomniacs would actually have shorter lives for exactly the reasons you're talking about, that it would affect immune system functioning and all these other things. For some reason, that doesn't appear to be the case. And the question is, well, what's going on for insomniacs that's not true of everybody else? Are they actually operating in some different way? Are there some different mechanisms that are work? And the answer to a lot of things in sleep is we don't actually know. We're uncovering all these interesting facts, but we don't have a complete picture. And that's why I was so interested in the fact that even since May, we have so much additional research that's coming out that's beginning to show new light on some of these things. So yes, there are some things we don't have complete answers for. Yes, that over here.
Just to follow on from that question, when you have taken species from that regard, I think in little, and the lifespan of those wouldn't actually follow. I mean, that 19 hours, the first 2 hours, they're not really sure, but I mean, I know a person's lifespan is probably the next in the back. There's no correlation between the lifespan.
No, not really at all. As you say, bats sleeping 19.5 hours sleep don't live longer than humans. Horses live longer than bats. So there's no real correlation between sleep and length of life.
But yet, the horse brings a good insomnia.
Well, I mean, again, it's part of the interesting things that we find. We're not entirely sure why we account for the fact that animals do sleep very different amounts. It's not down to things like brain complexity alone, because there's not a great complexity in a bat, for example, that needs 19.5 hours. There's not an enormous lack of complexity in a horse that only needs 2.9 hours. So the relationship between the amount of sleep and what's actually going on in terms of the biological activity within that animal, again, are not entirely clear. We're beginning to get some handle on some of the things that might be important because of the recent research that's showing things like gene expression, things like production of myelin, things like immune system functions. Whether that's going to answer the question of why a bat needs 19.5 hours and a horse needs 2.9, we don't know yet. So, sorry, there's so many hands here, but we've got to the back yet. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Not responding and sleep paralysis are unable to
Well, the difference is to do with the different state of the sleep that you're at. But when you're suffering with the motor activation and brain is interpreting that as you're stuck, it's not getting any feedback from the muscle. You're not actually, in any sense, conscious at that stage. The brain is simply making up stories that become part of the dream. The dream is not a conscious state in the sense that you're actually aware, unless you're lucid dreaming, of course, in which case you can take it. But in general terms, you are asleep at that point. Sleep paralysis generally occurs as people are waking up in that phase where they're not quite awake, not quite asleep, and where they are actually aware of a sensation at a conscious level, even though they're not actually fully aware and not actually fully aware of what's happening with that state. So it's about a different stage of sleep and a different level of consciousness that we're involved in the interpretation of the brain at that stage.
I don't know if I'm a silly person here. You find it much easier to sleep when I'm not supposed to be sleeping. So I'm on a train and I'm traveling to the end of the line. I hardly sleep very well, but if I've got to stay awake to get off at the intermediate station, I go out like life. Now, am I unusual? And if I'm not unusual, why did that happen? Any idea?
Well, people can develop different sleep patterns for all kinds of reasons, some of which is just habit. I mean, one of the things that happened to me is that I was flying up and down to London a lot. And I would have to get up early in the morning to do that. So I would catch the red-eye flight down to London because I had to be there for a meeting in the morning. So up at 4 o'clock in the morning, disrupting my normal sleep pattern. I would get to the airport, get on the plane. The minute I sat down in the seat, I would fall asleep. I would wake up as soon as they served breakfast. As soon as I'd had breakfast, I would fall asleep. As the plane was landing, I would wake up. I would get on the tube. And I was usually traveling on the Piccadilly line, which is about an hour from Heathrow Airport into the city centre. And I would fall asleep on the tube, wake up 2 stations before my, these were patterns I developed, and it's obviously an adaptive response. So in these sorts of situations where normal sleep is not happening or where other things are interfering with normal sleep patterns, you may develop other patterns. And you get people, for example, who always have a nap after dinner. You get people who sleeping extra long in the morning. So there are these different patterns that may develop, but they're personal to you to a large extent. Other people will have similar things, but not necessarily the same. Andrew? Well, it's got to do, again, I'm going to sort of wing it a bit here because I'm not entirely a biologist, but my understanding is that the muscles that control the eyes are actually controlled in a slightly different way by the brain. There's actually more direct control over your eyes and your optic process than there is over things like your arms and legs and so on. And that, in fact, your eye muscles can remain active while the rest of the motor system is actually shut down. So that's why you get the rapid eye movement, but nothing else is happening. Yeah.
And you very vividly, very briefly, this moment,
Well, the explanation is really basically because these things are things that are very prominent in your memory, are very prominent in your conscious, and therefore, when your brain shuts down, these are the easy bits of the jigsaw to access, and these are the bits that your brain will put together. So, if you're particularly worrying about some activity or, well, for example, I tend to dream about my mother a lot. Freud loved that. But my mother's dead, and, but I tend to think about the happy times I had with my mother. I sometimes miss her, and she crops up in my dreams more often, I think, as a result of that, because she's there at some higher level of the jigsaw than perhaps other bits, and therefore she's more likely to be a bit that the brain grabs and sticks into the dream. The more dominant and prominent particular experiences or emotions or memories are, the more likely they are to get incorporated into the dream. Yeah.
It's all common to have, as you're drifting off to sleep, some moment of hyper-awareness. I've experienced this myself. It's not all the time, but I've heard some people from an evolutionary psychology point of view. This is kind of just before you fall asleep, hyper-aware, going to make sure everything's okay, safe before you fall asleep. It's not accompanied with any kind of fear or terror or anything like that. It's just a moment of being really, really aware of everything. Not even opening your eyes when you're sleep. Is that something that you're going to sleep after?
Yeah, when you're falling asleep and when you're actually waking up, there are slightly different things are happening in the falling asleep stage and the waking up stage, and they're referred to as hypnagogic and hypnopompic sleep. And in some of these, your awareness is temporarily altered. And it's one of the reasons why very often when people, I was talking about, if you lie in bed too long after your sleep cycle is actually finished and you're not actually fully awake, but you're not actually fully asleep, you very often get extremely vivid dreams. And that seems to be because things like your awareness and so on are actually changed during that stage at the end of sleep. But the same happens at the beginning of sleep, but slightly differently. And people will often report that sense of, there is a moment where they have a kind of heightened awareness of things just immediately before they fall asleep. And that appears to be something that's happening as part of the falling asleep process. So these two things, hypnagogic, hypnopompic sleep, which are slightly different in the sleep pattern.
To hold on slightly, I enjoy those like hyper-real, amazing dreams that you get when you really should be really getting up and being a member of society. But the thing seems to be pretty much determined by how those dreams go. If they kind of get jumbled up and they're inconclusive, then it's the devil's own work getting me to function during the day. Whereas if I don't, yes, want the Ferrari, move everything, came back to bed, and now I'm ready, then they will be very functionally coherent.
Well, that's exactly why the research was saying don't lie in bed too long after you've finished your sleep cycle. I have to admit that I quite enjoy sometimes lying in bed till 10 o'clock in the morning, enjoying some of these vivid dreams. But one of the characteristics of these vivid dreams that happen at that time is that they quite often are disruptive and they quite often actually seem quite tangled. They very often seem to involve negative emotions of one sort or another. And they seem very, very real at that stage because you're not actually fully awake, you're not fully asleep. And as you just said, if you have that kind of negative dream at that point, it can disrupt some of the benefits that you actually got from your sleep cycle. And you're off to a bad start in the day, you get out of bed on the wrong side in the morning, and nothing seems to work after that. So the general rule, as I was saying earlier, is that on the whole, you shouldn't sleep too long. That if you sleep more than your normal sleep cycle, you're running into the risk that you might have some disruptive elements there that are going to upset you during the day or upset your sleep more generally. One more, I think, and then I'm probably going to have to stop. But so, yeah. How to promote it? Well, as I say, the funny thing is that the main evidence on that is that simply knowing you can do it seems to be one of the main things that enables people to do it. It's almost like it flicks a little switch in the brain that says, oh, next time I'm going through this, I know what that is. That's a lucid dream, and I can respond to it because of that. It's certainly something that improves with practice, I've found, and there again, some evidence of that the more people do it, the easier it actually becomes to do it. And again, it's like a lot of things. I was relating my own story of how it started because I was remembering being bullied by these lads in the park. And the appearance of these lads in the dream then became a trigger for suddenly realizing I was lucid dreaming. So there's a sort of practice element there that you learn to associate certain kinds of things in dreams, certain kinds of occurrences with the little switch going on and saying, I recognize this situation. This is a dream. But the main key thing just seems to be being aware that you can actually do that. And that seems to make you look at your dreams in a slightly different way, even though you're asleep. And as I say, we found that in the sleep lab. We could train people to actually let us know that they were aware they were dreaming. And they got better at it over time. Anyway, I think we really probably need to stop there because we're coming up to 10:30. So I shall hand back to Frank.
Well, I'll finish off the evening with pointing out just a few of the other things that are going on all around us all of the time. For example, the Edinburgh Philosophy and Psychology group. It's great. Edinburgh Skeptics in the Pub. Check them out. The intercultural group at Adult Learning Project. Fantastic. Children's University. I'm fascinated by about what people are doing all around us. And you've all made tonight, but particularly thank you, Ray, and thank you, Kieran, and thank you, everybody who brought something tonight, including your company. Cheers. Good night.